Well, what did you expect? It's not like this is an original concept. But what I've noticed is that it doesn't matter, because people don't pay attention to much of anything anyway. I was digressing a lot in the last video. That's true. It's just that the main issue here for this video addendum, which is to say the whole beginning theme of JRM, does have something to do with an abuse of power under the color of authority. It's connected to the recent nonsense over abortion, because that was an abuse of power too. We see how screwed up the courts are here in this country. This has been the agenda of the Republican Party, to control the courts, so it shouldn't be a surprise. They're worse in some other countries, but that's still no excuse. Fortunately, in the legal case I mentioned, the one I had the misfortune of witnessing, it was only on a smaller scale, that of a court of law in this country participating, possibly, I don't say I know for sure, but maybe being responsible to some degree, not only for a wrongful conviction, which I am sure about, that part I do know, because I was on the inside of it, but also for covering up a violent crime. I'm talking about one of the superior courts in California that had a judge, an appointed defense attorney, and a deputy DA coordinating in ways that were unethical and unlawful, in the sense that certain civil rights were intentionally denied. At least it wasn't murder, but it was still pretty bad, and it shouldn't go unexposed, or at the very least uninvestigated. Somebody should pay for that investigation. You see, it's one thing for average people who are just struggling to get by in life to be distracted as their criminal justice system becomes a horror show. But it's quite another for people who have high levels of education, and especially means and positions of privilege. If you can't do anything with those perks, then what's the point of having them? It just makes you the lowest of low. Again, going back to the Bob Dylan quote from number 12, "Don't know if I saw you, if I would kiss you or kill you." That's a little personal aside, but so be it. It's like the difference between being repelled by the hypocrisy of extremist wokeism, or being just as put off by all the wealth of this country going to a tiny percentage of the population over the last 50 years. Most people don't like either one of those things. But which of the two is more destructive with greater impact? And how do they relate with one another? Which one is less sympathetic and more offensive? That's a matter of taste, I suppose. When it comes to these court officers I mentioned and their crimes, all of which were detailed extensively in JRM 1 through 9, if these people have some beef with me for shining a tiny flashlight on their non-existent integrity, then let them step up to the plate and call me out for harming their reputations. And then we can search out the matter QB7 style and get into it. But of course, that won't happen. And it's not because there's a difference between defamation and whistleblowing. There is. But it's because it's far more likely that I will be silenced in some other way. Right? Right. We don't hear too much about this type of public crime, which has come to be known as tripartite corruption, because it's continually being covered up. In the videos that I made, I was trying to communicate some important information in a way where it could be transmitted at a time of the victim's choosing, at his discretion, if he chooses to do it, to transmit all of this to public agencies and nonprofits that are supposed to be set up for receiving complaints about corruption in the legal profession. These included, in my mind, the state and local bar associations, innocence projects, even the FBI. But to be just a little preemptive here, from the standpoint of suspecting, as I do, that it will be justified in the future, I want to focus for a minute on something called the California Commission on Judicial Performance. Most states have some kind of organization like this set up for the purpose of monitoring judicial conduct. They have no law enforcement power, but they do have the ability to discipline judges in certain ways. For convenience, we'll just call this commission the CJP. It uses a standard complaint form, as shown here. You'll notice the spaces for attorney information. Generally, you see this on innocence project applications as well, and it can be a problem, you know, especially if you happen to be someone who did not have competent legal representation. Why should a corrupt lawyer or lawyers be consulted first? That just seems like an off-ramp, doesn't it, for discarding the complaint. Not only that, but a lot of information that could be provided by reference on this type of form is ignored up front, especially if it's a reference to something conveyed online, because that's considered social media, quote unquote. Even a website or a book. And maybe even when those things are unpublished and totally private. The fact is, sometimes a whole range of things absolutely has to be and should be considered by an agency like this if its function is to respond to complaints honestly, with real interest, and to maintain ethical standards in a profession in a way that's real and not just bullshit. If it expects to be taken seriously as an organization capable of identifying conduct that could also be evidence of judicial corruption, it becomes even more critical not to be myopic, superficial, obtuse, or just stupid. The worst cases, by definition, involve a lot more than the bad behavior of just one judge. Now, I'm not knocking the CJP. If you read the sampling of cases it takes, and also if you look at this list of the types of conduct it investigates, it does include a lot. And I've even circled some that were relevant in our case. I'm talking more about what is morally imperative and whether or not these little categories can even measure up to that. They're certainly not proportional. Judges have enormous power, and when it comes to the ramifications of their failures, there's a huge difference between something like number 12 on this list, failure to ensure rights, which in our case led to a wrongful conviction and years of imprisonment, wherein the failure was not an accident, but rather done on purpose. There's a big difference between that and number 8, for example, demeanor, decorum. If a judge fails on number 8, it might be unprofessional, but it could also be brushed off easily by both the offending judge and the person or persons offended. You can see some judges just saying, okay, I lost my temper, sorry. And if disciplined, they'd probably just say privately, yeah, whatever, kiss my ass. The truth is, we all know they don't get punished for anything, and they get away with murder while you live in a trailer down by the river. I really enjoyed the way John Grisham dealt with this in his book, The Judges List. In his story, the fictional agency in Florida is the Board of Judicial Conduct, or BJC for short. The judge in question actually is a murderer, a serial killer. Grisham should have been given a medal just for making that the premise. He imagined the BJC, very realistically, doing all it could not to take the case. The heroine character who reports it is a black university professor, and there's this great line at the end of one of the chapters where she calls the director of the agency and says, "At some point you and your little BJC become complicit." I loved that line. At some point you and your little BJC become complicit. At what point does anyone become complicit? This is something I'd like you to think about now as I read from an article by John Barth Jr. He wrote this back in 2010, and I'm hoping under fair use he won't mind me quoting a good portion of it. It's still just so amazingly relevant. And it's what I've been leading up to here, so I hope you'll listen to this very carefully. It's called Why Judicial Corruption is Invisible. We all would like to believe that as when we were children in a family, there is in our society a final authority to whom we can turn in case we are seriously wronged. We are not predisposed to believe the accusers of the judicial process any more than the detractors of Santa Claus. Perhaps critics are merely sore losers or angry convicts, and perhaps judicial misconduct would be exposed by appeals courts or the mass media and corrected. Why guess our way without the facts? Such predispositions held by many otherwise educated adults allow pervasive institutional corruption of the judicial branch to remain hidden. Judicial corruption is invisible to citizens because lawyers are trained and motivated to deny and cannot safely speak of it, because mass media corporations agree with judicial prejudice and live in fear of judicial whims, because non-lawyers cannot obtain the facts without prohibitive cost and effort, and because the infantile myth of judicial salvation has broad appeal and is propagated as an opiate by the mass media. Judicial corruption is discovered by those of its victims, willing to do years of tedious research, and only they will speak of it. Lawyers do not speak against judges on whom they depend for income stability and success, and often aspire to be judges. They do not criticize law practice and precedent which they are selected and trained to accept regardless of validity, and which they could not otherwise use successfully. The mass media are silent because they and their advertisers are big businesses in agreement with judicial prejudice, advised by lawyers, and dependent upon judicial whim for protection from libel suits. They do not investigate judicial corruption. Now, Barth goes on here to describe a case in which he was personally involved, and he also provides a very cogent overview of the motives for judicial corruption. But for this addendum, and especially for how it speaks to the case I was involved with, it's his assessment of judicial hypocrisy that is just so poignant. He says, although the middle class is threatened primarily by subsidies of the wealthy, like wars, financial scams, inflated health care, and lawsuits, many are recruited to serve their exploiters by promises of wealth and hypothetical threats like terrorists, communists, fair taxation, and social welfare programs. Within the judiciary and among lawyers, as within large business corporations, middle-class aspirants see the path to wealth and power impaired by virtue and cleared by hypocrisy, and become evangelists for their overlords despite their own middle-class status and prospects. Most judges and lawyers seek to please and protect the wealthy and powerful, and will betray every moral code and public duty to humanity in hope of advancement and indirect bribes. Most pretend to believe and religiously ensure that wealth and power to help or harm themselves should decide all legal contests. There is a natural hierarchy of contempt among those who have earned little but hold wealth or power by accidents of birth and business, or by collusion and scheming. And I would just add another little nugget myself here from Stephen Brill, which is called aristocratic meritocracy. Throughout history, wealth and power have concealed their true sources, seeking to sanctify themselves by acquiring symbols of respectability and creating myths of superiority of race or class. If wealth and power are the measure of respectability, then less is less respectable, and little is contemptible, unless in the service of wealth and power. And so most judges and lawyers believe that those who do not have the wealth and power to help or harm them deserve to lose their rights. And finally, regarding the means of corrupt judgment, it is usually a simple matter for a judge to choose the most wealthy or powerful party in a legal case, or the outcome which serves himself, and to allow or dismiss the case, corrupt the facts, and instruct the preferred side to write a judgment within the pseudo-law of precedents and rationalizations favorable to the wealthy, which is the chief product of lawyers.